Hello, this is the second of a series of 4 podcasts that looks at Nazi family policy. This podcast will focus in on the actual policies to women, so it's this particular strand of the mind map here. So as you can see, we will look at employment, marriage, and their responsibility as mothers, and then we'll give an overall assessment of the policies towards women. Okay, so first of all, employment issues. As we said in the previous podcast, the Nazis, Hitler's view was very much that the workplace was for men, and that the place of women should be in the home, having as many children for the Reich, the empire. Remember, Nazi Germany was called the Third Reich, having as many children as possible. So very much of this traditional role of women as mothers. So that obviously impacted in terms of employment. So the key things you need to talk about, if you get a question on this in the exam, is that first of all, the Nazis pushed women out of the professions. We mentioned in the previous podcast that in the Weimar Republic, women, very unusually in comparison to other countries, had lots of jobs in the professions such as law, medicine, teaching, etc. But the Nazis immediately excluded women from those professions. This obviously made jobs available for men, which helped reduce unemployment. Remember, 6.1 million people unemployed when Hitler came to power in January 1933. It was his main campaign promise in the short term was to create jobs. It was one of the main reasons that he received so many votes. Remember, in March 1933, the Nazis were the largest party with 44% of the vote. And many of those people voted for Hitler because effectively they believed he could create work, a party of action that could actually create jobs. So this was a key strand forward. So how did they attract women into the home? Well, the key law that you need to mention is what we call the Law for the Encouragement of Marriage, which was passed in the summer of 1933. And very famously, it included the marriage loan scheme, what was called the marriage loan scheme, which basically lent couples who married 1,000 marks, which was equivalent to a month's wage, but only if the wife left employment to get married. Okay, so there was effectively the carrot that was dangled there was the state will give you a loan. Now, it was a loan, which meant that they had to pay it back, but nevertheless the loan was cancelled, or a quarter of it was cancelled for every child that they had. So there was an incentive to have as many children as quickly as possible. So you would cancel as much of the loan as possible. Also, incidentally, the loan was basically was given in vouchers that had to be spent in certain shops, and the type of shops that they could only be used in were sort of shops that sold household furniture and equipment. That effectively controlled the expenditure. They couldn't spend it on anything else. It had to be spent on domestic type goods. Okay, so that was a factor in boosting marriage. It certainly encouraged larger families, and we'll look at this at the assessment towards the end of this podcast. Probably more successful in attracting women to get married than actually attracting women to have large families, but it did have some success, no doubt about it. Okay, that's just of course the beginning, attracting women to get married. Ultimately their main goal was, once they were married, was to have as many racially healthy children as possible, so women as mothers. Okay, there was a Nazi women's organisation called the German Women's Enterprise. It was led by a woman called Gertrude Scholz-Klink, trying to learn that name, which basically indoctrinated or trained mothers in the correct values. So it gave classes on how to be a good mother. It issued regular radio broadcasts on motherhood, so that's all part of control. So remember, in the exam, if you get a question on propaganda, you don't just use the information in that particular section of your notes on propaganda. You can dip into other parts of your notes, and so that's a good example of a type of propaganda. The propaganda organisation for women was called the German Women's Enterprise. Okay, there were strict rules that ensured women married to produce racially pure children. So, as we say, the Ten Commandments for the choice of a spouse, that's I mentioned in the previous podcast, was a leaflet that was given to all women with a clear instruction that it wasn't just a question of finding a husband, it was a question of finding the correct husband, who had to be an Aryan husband. There were very, very strict laws that were introduced forbidding Aryan women from marrying non-Aryan men, which we'll look at in a later session when we do about Nazi racial policy. Okay, so very famously, the Motherhood Cross, that was given every 12th of April, which was Hitler's mother's birthday, sort of like a National Women's Day. This was basically a medal. Women who had 4 to 5 children were given bronze medals. Women who had 6 or 7 children were given silver, and women who had 8 or more children were given gold medals. Okay, and there's a picture there of Hitler awarding the Motherhood Cross medal. Now, key thing, and I really must keep emphasising this point, when you talk about Nazi policy, try to distinguish between time periods. The period 1933 to 36, which was the first 4 years of Hitler's rule, as a general rule, the Nazis were more popular with the German people than they were in the period 1937 to 39, which was the next 3 years, when increasingly the focus became on preparation for war. And then, of course, 1939 to 45, Germany was at war. Now, as we move beyond 1936, increasingly the focus on controlling people, on preparing for war. And of course, by then the Great Depression was retreating in people's memories, and so people were less happy, and the Nazis became less popular. But from 1937 onwards, it was increasingly difficult for people to speak out. It was too risky to speak out, because of course those methods of control, the Gestapo and the SS, etc., were much more established. But in the early years, 33 to 36, the Great Depression was still in people's minds. Hitler was new, the Nazis were exciting, they were introducing new policies. Hitler wasn't talking about preparing for war, remember, he kept that concealed. So the Nazis were more popular. Now, it was certainly very true for women, okay, that this sort of a trend. Until 1936, women leaving the workplace, going into the home, which increased their popularity. But after 1936, as the government prepared more and more for war, there was a problem. There was a shortage of workers. So, for example, conscription was introduced in 1935, where men had to join the army because Hitler was building up the German army. That meant women had to leave their workplace to join the army, so there was a shortage of workers in the workplace. So increasingly, there was a U-turn, an about-turn in policy towards women, and Hitler had to accept the fact women had to actually go back to the workplace. Now, Hitler never liked that, but he basically had to do it. So we see that U-turn. That U-turn caused confusion for women. They had been told that their place was in the home, and now suddenly the Nazis needed them to leave the home and go back to the workplace. Not all women, but that was a U-turn. So, and then 1939 to 45, there was a labour shortage. Increasingly, obviously, hundreds of thousands, then millions of men were being killed in the war. And even employing women in the workplace, there weren't enough. So the Nazis had to use prisoners of war and take them back to Germany. And again, during the war, Hitler was very reluctant to use women if he didn't have to. So often Russian prisoners of war were used in German factories and on German farms. Okay, so as an assessment, the German workers' enterprise on the whole had 6,000 members. Marriage and the birth rate did rise under the Nazis, but not as much as Hitler hoped. The number of working women fell in the early years, but 1936 onwards there's the U-turn. And only a small proportion of women had more than 3 children. Okay, certainly family sizes did increase, but not as much as Hitler had planned. There are the questions. Remember, you've got to have precise knowledge, so you can print that sheet off from the folder in Frog, cover the obviously on the podcast now you can just write the answers in. The version on Frog has got the answers, and just cover and retest until you get it right. The answers to those questions, if you just pause the podcast, but the answers to those questions here are on the next page in the podcast. So just pause and then go to that. So there are the answers to that question. That completes the second podcast on Nazi family policy. The third podcast will look at education policy. Thank you.